There is something really great about being able to move into your place. When you get the keys from the lawyer, you unlock the door, you walk in, and you begin to place all of the furniture in each of the rooms that you want it, and you place it exactly where it wants to go. You start hanging the pictures on the walls. You fill the cupboards with your dishes and the drawers with your utensils, and you go about making your place your own. There's something wonderful about having a home. Homes really function for us to serve two purposes. They function first as a place where we live, where we find rest, where we find this comfort and joy. We have bedrooms set up so that we can get our appropriate sleep, and we have these places where we can live and rest. And we also have places in our home where we can congregate and share company with one another. So we have our kitchen set up with tables, or our dining areas where we can congregate around the table and have conversations. We set up our living rooms so that we can face one another and chat and talk. And we make our homes places that they are not just for rest and comfort, but so that they are places where we can socialize, where we can enjoy one another. God gives His directions about how He wants His house to be set up. And we can look at Exodus, from Exodus 25 all the way to the end of Exodus 40, and discover that God has very specific decorating instructions. Now, this is no home and garden TV kind of design that God's setting up here. God has very specific designs about why He wants His home set up the way that He does. We set up our homes so that they're aesthetically pleasing, that they're beautiful, that they're restful. But God does more than just set it up so that it's got aesthetics and beauty, though it has all of that. That God is doing something far more. God had given Moses the commands about how to build the tabernacle, beginning in Exodus 25. And from Exodus 25 to Exodus 31, God had said, here's what I want you to do. We know from the account of the book of Exodus that Israel left Egypt on the first day of the first month of the first year. This was the beginning of their calendar, if you would. And as they left Egypt, they went, and it took them 3 months to get to the mountain of God, Mount Sinai. When they arrived at Mount Sinai, Moses went up the mountain, and we're told in Exodus 24 that he spent about 40 days up on that mountain. And so from the 3 months from leaving Egypt to arriving at Mount Sinai, plus the almost month and a half, 2 months that Moses was up the mountain, we know that they had spent about 5 months then as a people out in the wilderness. But we're told in Exodus 40 that it was on the first day of the first month of the second year, meaning that there had been about another 7 months where Israel had been taking all of the blueprints, taking the instructions of God, and putting it into a reality. They made the tabernacle, all of its furniture, all of its curtains, all of its posts, all of its utensils. And these 7 months they had spent preparing a dwelling place for God. And now on the first day of the first month of the second year, now God's house has been set up. We might wonder then, why on earth are there so many details about the tabernacle? Why the specifications, and why does God go to great lengths to tell us what this house of His is to look like? And why is it important? If we understand these things, then what we will discover are 3 things this morning. And I want us to see how clearly these 3 things are brought out in the book of Exodus for us practically in so many ways and for our joy. And the first is God's house. All of these instructions, all of these directions are so that we would know what it means to first meet with God. We might think about all of the commands that are given from Exodus 25 to 31, and then all of the details about the construction and the work and all of its putting together in Exodus 35 to 40 as a lot of superfluous detail. It can kind of come across after reading all these great stories in Genesis and all of the narrative in Exodus that we get to the construction and details and blueprints and we think, this feels really repetitive and boring. And yet, if we understand what's going on in these accounts of the construction and the blueprints, what we will find is that there's far more going on that helps us in the rest of the Bible story. The account of God and his details of the blueprints that he has for his house are not mere repetitious details. They're not just the details of a blueprint so that we might recreate a tabernacle. But rather what we find is that there are these rhythms and patterns all throughout this account. We hear, for example, that when God gives the speeches about how the tabernacle is to be set up, there are 7 speeches that are given in chapters 25 all the way through 31. And it begins with, "Then the Lord said." In each one of those references, "Then the Lord said," 7 speeches detailing how the tabernacle is to be laid out, the light, the oils, the priestly garments, the priests themselves, and culminating in Sabbath rest. There's not only these great details about what the Lord says about how it's to be constructed, but there's also these little indicators along the way where we're told about in Exodus 25, verses 7 and 18, that there are these precious stones that are to be used as part of the framework and design and beauty of the tabernacle. Not only that, but we go on to find that there are things that are specifically described. A lot of the furniture, the altars, and the incense that is offered, and specifically a tree that is to have lights that shine onto the bread. We're also told that before anyone could enter into the most holy place, that there was cherubim, these warrior angels woven into the very fabric of the curtain that would separate the most holy place from the rest of the tabernacle. We hear about the priestly garments even. And the priestly garments are ornate and beautiful and so descriptive that in Exodus 39, verses 24 through 26, we're told that the colors, the beauty, the ornate nature, but also that they're covered with these golden bell pomegranates. And we might wonder, what is going on? Why so many details? Why are they important? But the minute that we start to see that these details are echoing back and whispering back to something previous, then it begins to come together. God had given 7 speeches about the tabernacle, which very much parallel the 7 days of creation. That God had created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day He rested. And that 7th speech in Exodus 31, verses 12 to 17, is a speech about the Sabbath rest that God's people should experience in the tabernacle. That God's garden in Eden, it was full of these precious stones in Genesis 2, verses 11 and 12. And then just like those stones were in Eden, they're now in the tabernacle. We hear of the tree of life that was at the center of the Garden of Eden, just as there is this tree that shines its light in the tabernacle. We think of Genesis 3:24, the warrior angels, these cherubim who block the way to going back into the holy place of Eden, just as the holy place of the tabernacle had these cherubim woven into the curtain. And we think of the priestly garments with these pomegranate bells on them, just like Eden would have been full of the luscious fruit. In other words, what is going on is that the tabernacle is a going back to Eden, if you would. It's a remembering of God's first holy place in his first garden. It's this ornate, beautiful garden that's intended to show that what God desires is what he had originally planned, that his rest, the culmination of creation, his rest, Genesis 2, verses 1 and 3, would be realized in Sabbath rest for his people, and that God would dwell and walk among his people, as Genesis 3 gives hint to, that now God is saying what was lost when Adam sinned, when Adam fell and disobeyed, I'm going to recreate. There's a new creation that I'm doing and I'm making so that I might meet with you and you with me. And all of these details and all of the ornate instructions, they should not be missed as connecting us back to the original goal of creation, that humans were meant to be in fellowship with God and God with humans. This is the goal of the tabernacle, to meet with God. But not only is it to meet with God, but there is also this second very important part about the tabernacle, that God would meet with humanity and humanity with God so that they would remember God's salvation. That's the second thing that I want us to see. That they would remember God's salvation. God had first appeared to Moses. We need to go back to Exodus 3 here and trace out a couple of things. God had first appeared to Moses when Moses had fled Egypt and he was out in the wilderness and he was shepherding sheep, and he came to the mountain of God, we're told in Exodus 3. And when he came he came up to the eastern side of the mountain, and as he came, he saw up on the mountain this bush that was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. And as he approached, he heard the voice coming from the flames saying, "Take off your sandals, Moses, for the place that you are walking is holy ground." And now, coming into the holy presence of God, Moses takes off his sandals. He comes into the presence of God, and there he meets with God in this burning bush. And God says, I am going to deliver my people. I'm going to rescue them out of bondage and slavery. And when I do that, you'll come back to this same mountain and you'll worship me. And so in Exodus 19 and 20, Israel leaving Egypt, they come back to the very mountain where Moses had first encountered God in a burning bush. And there, Moses comes to this mountain, and God gives specific instructions. He calls Moses to come up the mountain, but he says to the people, you cannot come and touch the mountain or approach it or go up it. Exodus 19 verse 1. You can't, or Exodus 19:12, sorry. You can't go up it. You as the people have to stay at the base. And Moses sets up this barrier so that the people won't go up the mountain. And then the Lord calls in Exodus 24, he calls Moses, Aaron's sons, and the 70 elders of Israel to go up the mountain. But they're only allowed to go up part way. And as they go up part way, there we're told in Exodus 24, verse 11, that they have a meal with God. And they establish the covenant. But then God calls Moses to go the rest of the way up the mountain by himself. No one can go with him. He alone has to go. And there Moses meets God at the top of the mountain with fire and smoke and lightning and thunder. And just like Moses had met God on that mountain with fire, now he meets God again. Not in a burning bush, but with smoke and thunder and lightning and loud crashes. And there he hears the voice of God. And the tabernacle is this recreation not only of Eden, but also of God's saving of Israel. That when God had given the commands in Exodus 20, verses 1 and 2, he had said, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And now God is giving instructions about a house that's going to recreate Moses' experience in Exodus 3 and Israel's experience in Exodus 24. that as the people are not allowed to enter the tabernacle, just like they weren't allowed to go untouch the mountain, so it is in recreating the Sinai experience. That the priests can go into the courts, and they can go in just as Moses and the priests and the elders of Israel could go partway up the mountain, so these priests of Israel could go in to God's house. But only one person, the high priest, the mediator, could go to the top of the mountain and meet with God and receive his commands on the stone tablets. And in the same way, only one mediator could go into the most holy place and meet with God where those same stone tablets were. In other words, as God is there, in all of the lightning and thunder and crashing on the top of Sinai meeting Moses, and as the people are down below watching, the tabernacle was intended to recreate this saving experience. You'll come and worship me at this mountain, but I'm a holy God. You can't just approach me. You can't just come in and meet with me. There has to be the specifications that I've laid out for you to meet with me. And just as there was this lampstand, the tree of life that was in Eden, and just as God had revealed himself in smoke and thunder at the top of Sinai, so the priests were to come into that holy place where there was that tree of life, that lampstand, the light shining. And they would go in as though it was like a burning bush there in the holy place. And they were to take the incense and put it on a censer and walk into the holy place and fill the Holy of Holies with smoke. Just as Moses could not see the glory of God and live, and he had covered himself in smoke at the top of the mountain, so now Israel's priests cannot go into the holy place unless they also have this incense filling the room, protecting them from the glory of God. You see, God is saying by the tabernacle, not only do I want to meet with you like I met with you in the Garden of Eden, but he's saying I also want you to realize that since Eden, there's been a huge problem. That Adam had disobeyed. But now, because of the curse of sin, I'm about to reverse the curse. And I don't want you to forget that I dwell with you because I rescued you. I rescued you. And this act of worship and dwelling among you is to constantly remind you of the Sinai experience and of my saving power. That as I promised Moses that I would bring you to this mountain, that you would worship me, I never want you to forget my saving power. But there's a problem. We want to meet with God, and yes, we need to remember his salvation. But there's a problem. We need to deal with sin, and that's the third thing. That sin is such a massive barrier that no one can just walk into the tabernacle and come into that place. We're told in Exodus 40, verses 34 and following, that after Moses has built this tabernacle, he's erected it and all the structures are in place, the furniture is put in place, the utensils for all the offerings are properly located, the glory of the Lord in the cloud. Just as God's presence had been at the top of Sinai, now the glory that was on the top of Sinai descends onto the tabernacle. And God's presence fills the tabernacle. But there's a problem. Verse 35 says that as God's glory fills the tabernacle, Moses could not enter because of the glory. He couldn't go in. He was not able to meet with God. The man who had mediated for Israel at the top of the mountain in the presence of God now is not able to go in where God's presence dwells. And there's a problem. No one who is unholy, no one who has sinned can go up the mountain, can go into the presence, can meet with God in the tent. You can't just go there. It's interesting, if you go back to the beginning of Exodus 40, verse 1, there are these two words that are used to describe this dwelling place of God. It's in verse 2, actually. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, on the first day of the first month, you shall erect the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. Here are these two words. There's a tabernacle. The tabernacle just simply means the dwelling place. That God here lives. This is his home. This is where he dwells. But there's more than just God living here. It's also to be a place, just like we have our places in our homes where we live and dwell and rest. It is also intended to be a place, just like we have living rooms and dining room tables, where we meet. The tabernacle was a tent of meeting as well, and that holy place where God would come and dwell. And Moses can't go in there. Moses is not allowed. How can someone who is not perfect and holy and clean enter? And when we open up the book of Leviticus, what we find is that the answer is given here. Moses could not enter the tabernacle, Exodus 40, verse 35. But how does Leviticus begin? The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. And God is going to make a way for there to be fellowship, for there to be communion between humanity and God. And the way that that happens is spelt out over and over in the book of Leviticus, and especially in these first 7 chapters of sacrifices that are offered, of sacrifices to atone for sin, of sacrifices that are offered as a fellowship meal of communing with God. And they're spelling out how humans then can draw near. In fact, we don't see this as clearly in English, but it is there. It's there because when it talks about when you bring near, it's this idea of when you draw near, verse 2. When you draw near, bring your offering, we're told in verse 2 of Leviticus 1. But that word, your offering, could also be translated as that which is brought near. When you bring the heifer, that which you bring near. You draw near by bringing the sacrifice. And you bring the sacrifice so that you might wonder, who can come into God's presence? It's the one who brings the sacrifice, who trusts in the sacrifice, who rests in the blood of the sacrifice. You can't merely come into God's presence unless you have been called by God to go into that place where you draw near to him and he draws near to you. For as Moses understood that if God's glory was fully revealed to him, Exodus 33, 34, Moses would be consumed. And so there was always this veil, this covering, this smoke, this incense that would just block the full presence of the glory of God, lest it consume you. But every story whispers about a greater story. And every story is revealing the glory of Jesus Christ. And in Hebrews chapter 8, we're told that Moses followed all of the specifications for the tabernacle. He got the blueprints. And when he got the blueprints, when he rolled them open and he took a look, there they were. Now, I've got the blueprints here for the church, and I'm not very good at reading blueprints. It's got HVAC unit schedules and exhaust fan schedules, and there's all sorts of numbers on here and designs, and I don't have a clue. And I could look at these things, these blueprints, and go, I don't begin to understand. But I'm in this building right now, and I'm enjoying being in this building and being able to worship with you and meet with you and fellowship with God. Well, in the same way, we're told in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, that what Moses was given, all of the instructions and all of the details, it says that they were a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. They were the blueprints of what's in heaven. Yes, the tabernacle looked very real. You could touch it, you could feel it, but it wasn't the ultimate reality. It was pointing to a greater reality. It was pointing to a heavenly reality. And in Hebrews 8 goes on to say that the better reality is not the tabernacle, but it is Jesus Christ. It's Christ who comes, who dwells among us. And this is why when John begins his gospel, when John starts it off, he takes us all the way back to creation. In the beginning, John says, in the beginning was the Word. The voice that thundered on Sinai, the voice that spoke those 10 commandments, the voice that spoke to Moses was there in the beginning. And at the beginning, when that voice spoke and created everything, when that voice thundered from Sinai, it now came, we're told, in John 1 verse 14. It came, the Word became flesh. And it literally tabernacled among us. And what Moses experienced on the mountain, when he had been in the cleft of the rock and said, Lord, show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will let all of my goodness pass before you. And in Exodus 34, verse 6, as the Lord passes by, he says to Moses, the Lord, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. John says, well, Moses couldn't see the glory of God and live. Moses says, and we have seen his glory. John 1:14. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth. And those words, grace and truth, are the words that parallel the Old Testament concept of steadfast love and faithfulness. In other words, the glory that passed in front of Moses, that Moses could only see the backside of the glory of God. John says, I've seen the glory. I've seen that glory walking in flesh and blood. His name is Jesus. He's come and he's dwelt among us. And as he's come and as he's dwelt among us, we don't die when we see the glory of the Lord, but rather we experience the rest of God. It's interesting that in the Gospels, that when Jesus comes, there are all these Sabbath controversies. I just think of John 9, where Jesus comes and he heals a man who was born blind, and he heals him on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was to be this day of rest, but the religious leaders of the day, they got so bent out of shape about the rules that we're told in Mark 2, verses 27, Mark 2:27, that Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. We weren't created to keep the rules of Sabbath so that we honor Sabbath as though it's the thing that is the most important, like we're serving Sabbath, but rather the Sabbath was created to serve us, to give us rest. And so Jesus does all sorts of miracles on the Sabbath. He heals a man with a withered hand. He opens the eyes of a blind man. And he brings about the restoration that was intended at the very beginning that God had created in Eden, the joy of being in the presence of God. Now people get to experience. And as he does that, it's as though what we're hearing in the beginning is a return back to Eden. In the beginning was the Word. That Word came and dwelt among us so that we would see his glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth, the one who's taking us back to, well, no, not taking us back to Eden, but taking us to a better Eden, to a better country. And the way that we now dwell and meet with God, Hebrews 9 says, Hebrews 9 verses 11 through 14, it's not through the blood of bulls and goats that Leviticus describes, but it's by the blood of him who offered himself. That Jesus comes and he does all these restorative works on the Sabbath and goes to the cross. Why? So that we would find rest for our souls. That we would be brought back to meet God. that we could dwell in his presence and not be consumed, that we could see his glory and live. And as we then believe that this sacrifice allows us to come before God, Paul will then say in 1 Corinthians 3:16 that we are God's temple. We're God's dwelling place. And the way that he takes up residence in you and me is that glory that showed up on Sinai, that glory that filled the tabernacle, is the glory now by his Spirit who dwells in us. He dwells in all who believe, trusting in the sacrifice. And we long to know God's presence. We long to dwell with him. We long to live with him. And yet we know that we don't fully experience it here and now, do we? There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of sorrow. Sometimes we wonder if God has forgotten us. Does he remember us? And yet, we are told at the end of Revelation, in Revelation 21, verse 3, that the God who sees and knows all of our pain will one day, he'll wipe every tear from our eye. All the pain, all the sorrow, all those wonderings if God has been with us. He'll wipe every tear from our eye. As John says in Revelation 21, behold, the dwelling place of God is with men. And he wipes those tears from our eyes. So this means then, now, as Hebrews 10 says, Hebrews 10:19, we can come boldly into that tent of meeting. We can come boldly into that holy place where only the priest could go, where only Moses could go to the top of the mountain, where only the priest could go into the holy place. Now we can come boldly before his throne of grace. And we can bring our prayers, and we can bring our worship, and we can bring our adoration, because we who have received the blood of the sacrifice that lets us come into that most holy place is the one who invites us in. But not only does he invite us into his presence, we hear in Matthew 28, verses 18 and following, that Jesus says, all authority has been given to me. So he says to his disciples, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching everything that I've commanded. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The God who dwells in you sends you out as mobile worship centers, if you would, to spread his presence by telling others about the good news, that God's presence might be multiplied in others. And as he sends us out with this word of the gospel, you can draw near to God. And the way you draw near is by the blood of Jesus. And you can come and not only meet with God, but you can remember his saving work and rejoice in him forever. We remember then that as we feast, just as those elders did in Exodus 20, verse 11, and had a meal with God, we hear the echoes of David, who says, you bring me into your presence, you fill this table with abundance of food, my cup overflows, and most certainly mercy and goodness shall follow me all the days of my life. The loving kindness and faithfulness of God, the grace and mercy and truth. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.